It's the other Game & Watch. Welcome to the sad, short world of NES Works Gaiden Casio.
You cowardly bastard! You're not the voice of the people! I am the voice of the people!
At this point, I think we all understand that the narrative that video games died in 1983 with the Atari crash represents a small parochial point of view. American consoles and arcades may have shriveled up to about nothing around that time, but everywhere else, video games were thriving. That's especially true in Japan, where 1983 marked the arrival of a fertile, vibrant home console market that would lead the way for video game innovation around the world for 2 decades. Every corporation that could pull together a little programming code and wrangle some manner of hardware manufacturing attempted to launch their own game console, following in the steps of Epoch CassetteVision and Epoch Atari 2600. There doesn't seem to have been any particular rhyme or reason to which of Japan's corporate entities attempted to become console powerhouses in 1983. A company like Sega makes perfect sense. They had established themselves as an arcade force to be reckoned with thanks to international hits like Turbo and Zaxxon. And a home console on which to play those games, a mirror image of the enormous success the company had enjoyed licensing home titles for US release via ColecoVision, seemed like the most natural thing in the world. Toy manufacturers also seemed to be shoo-ins for that sort of move as well. Retailers tended to lump video games in with toys on store shelves more often than not, and the medium appealed to the same demographic that gravitated toward toy shops. So when toy makers Nintendo, Bandai, and Tomy launched the Family Computer, Arcadia, and Puta Jr. respectively, the entire world more or less said, yes, this makes sense, and is as it should be. Honestly, the oddest contender we've seen so far has to have been Gakken, an education-focused publishing company whose bizarre TV Boy system had nothing whatsoever to do with textbooks. But even Gakken's move had precedent, as the company's line of LCD, LED, and VFD-based miniature gaming devices had been enormously successful, putting Gakken in the same company as pre-Famicom Nintendo and Epoch. That experience didn't transfer to the home console space at all for them, but you can understand why Gakken might have thought it had the know-how to make it big in video gaming, though there is absolutely no explanation for how they landed on the clumsy, underpowered TV Boy as the vessel for those ambitions. Of all the corporations to have made a bid for home console dominance in 1983's Japan, though, none must have seemed quite so inevitable as Casio. Certainly Nintendo, Epoch, and Bandai had enjoyed varying degrees of success with their early home gaming efforts, like the TV Block and TV Jack, and of course Sega had its sights set on a coin-op rivalry with the indomitable Namco. But Casio was, well, Casio, one of the true giants of consumer electronics. Casio had emerged in the wake of Japan's crushing defeat in World War II, a turn of events that left the country largely destitute. Casio's founder devised a simple, inexpensive gadget that acknowledged the hardscrabble reality of life in Japan during the latter 1940s, allowing consumers to easily economize their precious cigarette consumption. And that became a hit. The company quickly turned its focus to mechanical and electrical devices, and as Japan rebuilt itself into one of the world's premier economies, Casio's ambitions grew accordingly. Casio played a huge part in the development of the modern electronic calculator, the modern electric wristwatch, and more. When Douglas Adams wrote about wristwatches as the pinnacle of human technology, his tongue-in-cheek remarks were inspired by Casio's creations. In particular, Casio released the Casiotron in 1974, the world's first LCD-based electric wristwatch. You may recall that Nintendo had its first hit in video gaming thanks to the Game & Watch product line, beginning in 1980, and that just about every other Japanese company to throw its hat into the console manufacturing arena in the early 80s laid down its foundation for that move by copying Game & Watch. Well, Casio created the technology that made Game & Watch possible in the first place. In a very real sense, Casio created the Japanese home gaming industry, or at the very least, they contributed predominantly to its DNA. I'm sure Nintendo and its competitors would have made video games eventually anyway, even if Casio had never built a watch around LCD screens and crystal oscillators. But the direction of Japanese gaming history likely would have turned out radically different without the Casiotron. So when Casio launched its own console in 1983, it must have seemed like the most obvious move ever, an electronics powerhouse that had become a global pioneer of miniaturized consumer gadgets stepping into an arena largely built on its own inventions. Well, of course, how could they not? What surely did come as more of a surprise is the fact that Casio's efforts were utterly, profoundly disastrous. The company's home system fared better than Gakuen TV Boy, but that's a low bar to clear, and only really in terms of volume. The PV-1000 console saw just a touch more than twice as many game releases as TV Boy. But given that TV Boy only ever had 6 games, that hardly seems like a point of any particular pride. According to the few English language resources that have bothered to even write about PV-1000, the unlucky 13 games that Casio published for the device all shipped alongside the system in October 1983, which, yes, was the same month that TV Boy debuted. GameKraken and a few other sites suggest that Casio killed the PV-1000 within a matter of weeks after its debut. Now, I doubt the company literally pulled it from shelves, but I could potentially see them deciding not to move forward with additional manufacturing or software development. In any case, this has caused the PV-1000 to become one of history's rarest consoles. Although the machine itself is reasonably easy to track down and find for sale online, it tends to be expensive, and the software can be maddeningly difficult to come by. And to be honest, I can't for the life of me explain why the PV-1000 imploded. It's a pretty solid system for a 1983 release, admittedly lacking the power of Nintendo's Famicom, but certainly on par with Sega's SG-1000. In fact, the PV-1000's internals aren't wildly different from those of the SG-1000, ColecoVision, and MSX. Casio went with the exact same Zilog-based Z80 spec as those other systems, running at 3.58 MHz, and gave their system twice as much RAM as Sega's console. Still, the software doesn't look entirely identical to the games on those systems because Casio dared to use a graphics chip outside the ubiquitous Texas Instruments TMS family. Although the console outputs the same resolution as its non-Famicom competition, it could only generate half the colors, with a palette lacking the soft pastel tones of the TMS. Casio did make another smart choice with the hardware in removable controllers. Rather than forcing the same hardwired permanent controllers as Famicom, Super Cassette Vision, SG-1000, and TV Boy upon everyone, Casio allowed players to plug and play different input devices. Now granted, the console didn't exist long enough to ever see any sort of alternate controllers, but it does mean that, unlike with all of Japan's other consoles from that era, a busted or worn-out joystick doesn't render the entire system useless. That's pretty great because even though the 2-button joystick Casio designed works pretty well, I've been able to record footage for this series using a modded NES controller, which is kind of cheating because the joystick has much more travel and slower response than the NES D-pad, but oh well. It's also worth noting that my console itself is modded for composite video output, bypassing the complications of trying to tap into the Japanese frequency RF signal that the system used by default. Special thanks once again to Krista Lee of Sound Retro Company for the mod, and to Klaus of Team Europe for the hacked NES controller. There's a lot to like about the PV-1000, but perhaps the most impressive thing about the system is its software library. Of the baker's dozen of cartridges Casio produced, 11 of them were licensed releases from arcade giants of the era, the other 2 being the obligatory pachinko and mahjong carts you find on every system. Now bear in mind that as of October 1983, the Famicom and SG-1000 had exactly 0 externally licensed carts. The Othello Multivision had 3, if you count Othello, TV Boy had 2, and the Puta Jr. had a handful. But the PV-1000 had no less than 11 recognizable arcade releases from a variety of licensors on day one. Konami, Jaleco, Universal, even mighty Namco itself. That's an absolutely packed lineup, and the ports are pretty solid, too. This version of Super Cobra spanks the weirdly renamed version that appeared on TV Boy. Pooyan doesn't look as nice on PV-1000 as it would 2 years later on Famicom, but it plays faster and arguably more precisely. Dig Dug is perfectly respectable here, and to my knowledge, these are the only ports to Japanese consoles for games like Ladybug, Warp and Warp, and Naughty Boy. And all of this for a sticker price of about 15,000 yen, putting PV-1000 right at the same cost tier as Famicom and SG-1000. By all measures, PV-1000 should have been a hit. At the very least, it should have punched at the same weight class as SG-1000, a console whose performance encouraged Sega to continue making consoles for nearly 20 years. And yet PV-1000 has become an obscure, hard-to-find, expensive footnote in video game history. Casio ducked out of the console market for more than a decade, eventually returning in 1995 with the beloved Loopy. So, what happened? How did this perfectly excellent little system plunge immediately into a state of failure? How did it become the 1983 equivalent of a mobile game announcing its launch and shutdown in the same tweet? GameKraken speculates, and I think they're correct, that PV-1000 was doomed by the simultaneous release of the PV-2000. Casio adopted one of the most bizarre hardware strategies I've ever seen, the sort of thing that you'd expect from post-crash Atari. As Casio rolled out the PV-1000 console, it also shipped a home computer called PV-2000. You might think that these two devices would have some sort of shared relationship, similar to, say, the Atari 400 and 800 computers, one being a more powerful version of the other. After all, that approach was all the rage in the console market at the time. Coleco had been hyping up its ColecoVision-powered Atom computer for a while at this point, and Sega had actually delivered by allowing consumers to slap a keyboard on their SG-1000 to turn it into an SC-3000. Surely, Casio had chosen to operate in the same mode, right? This assumption would not be correct. The PV-2000 ran on an architecture similar to the PV-1000's, and its games all shipped in cartridges that looked exactly like the PV-1000's, but for some stupid reason you could not use software for one device on the other. See, the PV-2000 did use a graphics chip drawn from the ubiquitous TMS family, and it boasted twice as much RAM as the PV-1000, meaning games for one platform couldn't function on the other, despite the devices running on the same processor. At the same time, the PV-1000 still only had half the RAM allocation as a Model 1 MSX, and included a different type of sound chip, so it wasn't quite an MSX variant either. No, Casio also shipped two MSX models in 1983, both of which also had names that started with PV. These MSX systems directly competed with its own legacy systems, and was almost but not quite compatible with them. What a weird choice. What in God's name was Casio thinking? So, the relationship between Casio's devices worked more like that of the Atari 400 and the Atari 5200, basically two versions of the same thing, but incompatible for reasons that only some lunatic Casio engineer could explain. But you wouldn't look at the PV family lined up on a store shelf and think, oh, these are two entirely separate devices that have nothing to do with one another. Casio made the absolutely deranged decision to ship PV-2000 games in boxes that looked almost entirely identical to PV-1000 boxes. The only consumer-facing distinction between the two families of software was the color of the end bands on the boxes, red for PV-1000 and black for PV-2000. Would you look at these two packages behind a shop counter and think to yourself, these two games are clearly for entirely different systems and have no functional connection to one another? Of course you wouldn't, because you're not a dead-eyed sociopath. And the weird thing is, I don't know that Casio ever even released non-game software for PV-2000 outside of a single drawing program called Rakugaki Special. It didn't need to be a computer. Its short life effectively made it a console, but a little more expanded and a lot more expensive. Though its modern legacy amounts to being a system that is almost impossible to acquire in proper working order thanks to the cheap material that Casio used for its membrane-style keyboard. A PV-2000 with a keyboard that has yet to disintegrate with age is truly a video gaming unicorn, though perhaps less rare than the system's horse racing game Daishogai Keiba, an MSX port for which the only online evidence of its existence consists of tiny smudgy photo thumbnails and screenshots that could have been taken from the MSX release. So, anyway, the PV-1000. What a weird system. But it is pretty neat if you take it on its own terms. With a super clean physical design, well-crafted controllers that worked on both the console and its weird cousin, the PV-2000, and a killer lineup of solid arcade ports, PV-1000 is easily the best of the also-ran Japanese consoles to have burst onto the scene while the American console market fell to pieces. The Japanese console race was Casio's to lose, and they certainly did. But at least we got a home port of Tutankhamun in the process, and of Dirty Chameleon, too. Yeah. Because the PV-1000 library consists primarily of arcade ports, it features a lot of games that showed up on other consoles as well. Case in point, we have Pooyan by Konami, which also showed up on Famicom, although this version beat that one to the market by about 2 years. This works pretty incisively as a lead-off title for PV-1000, neatly summing up all that is good and bad about it. Casio locked down a ton of recognizable licenses from major arcade developers and had a heck of a lineup in 1983. And this version of the game plays pretty well. It lacks some of the visual details of the arcade version, naturally, and it doesn't look nearly as cute or colorful as the Famicom version that Hudson would create toward the end of 1985. But this version of Pooyan plays exactly like, well, Pooyan. You control a pig in a dumbwaiter who has to shoot down a legion of hungry wolves with your archery skills before they can slip past your defenses and devour your piglets. The wolves rise and descend by way of balloon, tossing rocks at you while cannily blocking your attacks with their shields. You can't shoot the wolves with arrows, but you can take out their balloons in the short moments during which they lower their defenses, piercing the balloon and sending them plummeting to a wolfy death. Every once in a while, the piglets will pass along what appears to be a hunk of roasted meat, not a pork roast one hopes, which you can collect and fire tactically at the wolves. The meat, or flaming arrow, or whatever it is, somehow passes through all defenses and balloons, allowing you to take out an entire line of wolves in a single shot. Gameplay alternates between stages. In odd stages, the wolves descend slowly and will rush over to the alcoves along the cliff wall behind your dumbwaiter. Once all the alcoves fill with wolves, the game ends because they've turned your children into bacon snacks. But even before they reach the top, allowing wolves to man the walls forces you to play with caution, since they can attack you from behind if you pause too long on their level. In even stages, the wolves instead ascend to the top of the screen, where they man a boulder to push onto your pulley system. Obviously, allowing enough of them to reach the top so that they can move the rock and cause it to plummet onto your head also amounts to a game over. The PV-1000 version captures all of this, albeit in a somewhat mundane-looking fashion. This Pooyan won't win any prizes for graphics or sound, though it does look to be on par visually with the Atari 8-bit computer versions of the game, which is to say, respectable. But here's the thing, this port doesn't begin to compare to the PV-2000 version of the game, which of course shipped right around the same time as the PV-1000 cartridge in nearly identical packaging. The PV-2000 game boasts more detailed visuals, an expanded color palette, and tons of extra details. For example, in the PV-2000 release, an arrow deflected by a wolf's shield won't simply vanish, but will drop to the ground. These are small details in the grand scheme of things, but those little details counted for a lot back in the days when video games had to run in a few kilobytes of code. Pooyan for PV-1000 does just fine, but Pooyan for PV-2000 does even better. So why would anyone settle for the lesser rendition? Like Pooyan, you'll probably also recognize Konami's Super Cobra from a console that I've covered here. In this case, though, that console was the Gaiden TV Boy, so needless to say, this version whips its ass. Again, this is admittedly a low bar to clear, but Super Cobra for PV-1000 moves a lot more smoothly than Chitaiku Daisakusen for TV Boy. However, when it comes to PV-1000, you always have to grade on a curve, and the PV-1000 version inevitably comes in right at the middle of the curve. It's the meanest console ever. That was a math joke. Not unlike Pooyan, Super Cobra also shipped for PV-2000 in largely identical packaging that contained superior software. But in this case, the delta between PV-1000 and 2000 was much greater. Casio's computer version of the Konami arcade hit comes impressively close to matching the coin-op release. Just about every element is accounted for, including the dual attack mechanic, the fuel management, the multi-trajectory enemy attacks, the rugged scenery, and the low ceiling. On PV-1000, Super Cobra recreates like half of this. Seemingly bound by the console's limitations, it scales back the environments, then throws in some new elements to help pad out playtime. Fundamentally, there's no mistaking this for any game besides Super Cobra. You pilot a helicopter that can fire bullets straight ahead and drop bombs downward as you skim erratic terrain dotted with gun emplacements, missiles, and fuel tanks. You need to avoid smashing into the ground, dodge enemies and enemy fire, and prevent your attack copter from running out of gas by detonating fuel tanks. The components are all here, even if the particulars differ in places. For example, the fact that you drop bombs straight down rather than in a forward arc. But you get the point, and as arcade to home conversions go, Super Cobra falls once again right there in the middle of the two extremes between arcade perfect and what the hell even is this? But it does suffer from some pretty significant changes. For starters, you only need to worry about the scenery in one direction, below. The jagged cave ceilings of the arcade game don't appear here at all, giving you totally clear skies to sail through and completely abandoning the claustrophobic navigation that defines so much of Super Cobra and Scramble. Given that the flow of action in Super Cobra worked around phases that took you into and out of the cave systems while constantly cycling through different hazards, this makes for a greatly reduced game. Or so I assume anyway. The PV-1000 version of Super Cobra makes some design adjustments that make this an incredibly difficult game, arguably much harder than the arcade version. I don't actually know how many phases this Super Cobra cartridge contains, because the second sequence cranks up the challenges to the max. In the arcade game, you had to contend with a sequence of aerial mines, fireballs, and UFOs across the different combat waves. Here, all of those threats have been combined into a single enemy type. The aerial mines hovered in place and would home in on your chopper at close range, the fireballs flew straight ahead, and the UFOs hovered in place while flitting about in small erratic motions. The airborne hazards you face here merge all of these traits into one. They streak forward as quickly as the fireballs, skitter erratically like the UFOs, and home in on the player like the aerial mines. Making it through Phase 2 alive, Phase 2, which consists entirely of these flying objects, takes real skill and a touch of luck. Making it through Phase 4, which is like Phase 2 except with ground emplacements that fire at you once you cross their line of sight, is basically a test of religious faith. Meanwhile, the lack of overhead scenery affects the combat stage in other ways as well. For example, the basic ground-to-air missiles that appear in the early waves of the arcade never show up here. The PV-1000 version jumps immediately to the second type of missile, which fires upward in an arc before doubling back and crashing to the ground. It feels like the programmers at Casio or Konami or Tosei or whoever assembled this version of Super Cobra had a reckoning with the system's technical limitations and compacted the arcade experience into the most faithful rendition they could manage, favoring the most difficult aspects of the coin-op. I can't say that this would be my go-to if I wanted to play Super Cobra, but it does the job just fine. I respect the fact that whoever programmed this iteration of the game made an effort to reconcile with the fact that the PV-1000 could only do so much by adjusting the game's design in interesting ways, albeit unfair ways. Like seriously, that aerial phase design is ridiculous. Next time on NES Works Gaiden Casio, Casio brings other arcade heavy hitters home in a perfectly cromulent fashion.